The possibility of the Pittsburgh Steelers ever moving on from T.J. Watt once felt completely unthinkable. For years, Watt has represented everything the Steelers want their franchise to embody: toughness, intensity, leadership, consistency, and defensive dominance. He is not just another superstar player wearing black and gold. He is the face of the defense, the emotional heartbeat of the locker room, and one of the defining players of an entire era of Steelers football. That is exactly why recent speculation surrounding his future has become one of the most shocking discussions currently developing around the NFL. According to ESPN insider Jeremy Fowler, multiple executives around the league believe what could eventually emerge as a legitimate trade candidate during the 2027 offseason. Even hearing those words attached to a player like T.J. Watt sounds almost impossible for Steelers fans to process. Watt has spent nearly his entire professional career establishing himself as one of the greatest defensive players in franchise history, and considering the Steelers' legendary tradition of defensive excellence, that statement carries enormous weight. Still, NFL history has shown repeatedly that difficult financial decisions eventually arrive for every organization, even when iconic players are involved. Fowler's report centers around a combination of age, contract structure, roster-building philosophy, and the future financial outlook of Pittsburgh's defense. Watt will turn 32 years old in October of the 2027 season, and while that may not sound ancient for an elite player, NFL teams are always forced to think several years ahead when planning massive contracts. Pass rushers often remain productive into their early 30s, but organizations also understand how quickly decline can arrive once injuries, explosiveness, and physical wear begin accumulating. At the same time, Watt's financial impact on the roster is becoming increasingly massive. The Steelers already committed enormous money to him this offseason when they finalized another 3-year extension worth approximately $123 million. Before that deal, Watt had already signed a 4-year extension worth more than $112 million that included roughly $80 million fully guaranteed at signing. Pittsburgh has continuously rewarded him as one of the premier defensive players in football, and understandably so considering his production over the years. But eventually, every contract creates long-term consequences. According to Fowler, Watt is currently scheduled to carry guaranteed salaries of roughly $32 million during both the 2026 and 2027 seasons. That is an extraordinary amount of money tied to one defensive player, even for someone as accomplished as Watt. In today's NFL, where quarterbacks consume massive portions of salary caps and elite receivers, offensive tackles, and cornerbacks continue pushing market values higher every offseason, maintaining roster balance becomes increasingly difficult. That is where the conversation surrounding Nick Herbig enters the picture. League executives reportedly believe Pittsburgh may soon face another enormous financial commitment involving Herbig, who continues developing into one of the most intriguing young edge defenders on the roster. The Steelers have long prioritized investing heavily in pass rushers because of how critical they are to defensive success, but there is a realistic limit to how many major contracts one organization can justify at the same position group. And that creates the uncomfortable question nobody in Pittsburgh truly wants to ask. Can the Steelers realistically afford to maintain multiple massive contracts at outside linebacker while also trying to build a complete roster around them? That question becomes even more complicated when considering the broader direction of the franchise over the next several years. Pittsburgh is already navigating uncertainty at quarterback, preparing for potential future roster restructures, and continuing to invest heavily in the offensive line. Eventually, difficult financial sacrifices may become unavoidable somewhere on the roster, regardless of emotional attachment to specific players. Still, this situation feels different because of who T.J. Watt is to the Steelers organization. Watt is not simply an elite pass rusher. He has become the modern face of Steelers defense in the same way players like Troy Polamalu, James Harrison, Joey Porter, and Mean Joe Green once defined previous eras of Pittsburgh football. His relentless motor, physicality, emotional intensity, and ability to completely take over games perfectly align with the identity the franchise has embraced for decades. That is exactly why Fowler specifically described Watt as a legacy player within the organization. Players with legacy status are treated differently. Teams often become more willing to absorb financial risk or potential decline because of what those players represent culturally. They become part of the organization's identity rather than merely employees on the roster. What absolutely falls into that category for Pittsburgh? Since arriving as a first-round pick in 2017, he has transformed into one of the most dominant defenders in football while simultaneously becoming one of the most respected leaders inside the locker room. Looking back at his career trajectory makes the possibility of a future trade feel even more surreal. When Pittsburgh selected Wood in the first round of the 2017 NFL Draft, there was immediate intrigue because of his athletic upside and famous football bloodline. As the younger brother of former NFL superstar J.J. Watt, expectations naturally followed him into the league. But even with those expectations, very few people could have predicted just how dominant T.J. Watt would eventually become. After signing his rookie contract worth approximately $9.258 million over 4 years, Watt steadily developed into the centerpiece of Pittsburgh's defense. The Steelers later exercised his fifth-year option for roughly $10.089 million before eventually rewarding him with a massive extension that established him among the highest-paid defenders in football. Every step of the process reflected how valuable he had become to the organization. And throughout that entire journey, his production consistently justified the investment. Even during the 2025 season, Watt remained one of the most disruptive defensive players in the league despite battling the physical demands that naturally come with years of elite pass rushing. In 13 games, he recorded 53 total tackles, 10 tackles for loss, 7 sacks, 1 interception, 7 passes defended, 3 forced fumbles, and 2 fumble recoveries. Those numbers may not fully capture the complete impact he still has on opposing offenses, because Watt's presence alone often changes protection schemes, forces double teams, and creates opportunities for teammates across the defensive front. Opposing offenses still game plan specifically around him every single week. That type of influence is incredibly difficult to replace, which is why many Steelers fans will immediately reject any discussion involving a potential trade. From a purely emotional standpoint, the idea feels almost offensive. Why would Pittsburgh ever willingly move on from one of the greatest defensive players in franchise history? The answer, unfortunately, comes down to the harsh realities of NFL roster construction. The league is ultimately built around difficult timing decisions. Teams constantly battle the fear of moving on from stars too early versus holding onto them too long. If organizations wait until visible decline fully arrives, trade value disappears almost instantly. On the other hand, moving on too soon can destroy locker room trust, alienate fan bases, and weaken championship windows unnecessarily. That balance becomes especially complicated with legendary players. The Steelers traditionally prefer allowing iconic veterans to finish their careers in Pittsburgh whenever possible. Organizational loyalty has long been part of the franchise's culture. But the modern NFL salary cap creates pressures that sometimes force even the most stable organizations into uncomfortable decisions. And executives around the league clearly believe Watt's situation could eventually become one of those moments. Another important factor is the timing of Pittsburgh's broader roster cycle. If the Steelers aggressively pursue a young franchise quarterback in the 2027 NFL Draft, as many around the league already expect, the organization may suddenly need enormous financial flexibility to support a new era offensively. Rookie quarterbacks eventually require expensive supporting casts, offensive line investments, skill position contracts, and defensive depth to compete consistently at the championship level. Maintaining several massive veteran defensive contracts simultaneously could become increasingly difficult in that environment. That does not necessarily mean a Watt trade is likely. In fact, there are still strong arguments suggesting Pittsburgh may never seriously consider moving him regardless of financial pressure. Truly elite edge rushers remain among the most valuable players in football, and Watt's leadership inside the locker room carries significance that extends far beyond statistics. There is also the emotional component tied to what he means to the fan base and the franchise identity itself. But what once sounded impossible is now at least being discussed quietly in league circles. And that alone is enough to make the situation fascinating. The emergence of Nick Herbig only intensifies those conversations because of the upside he continues showing as a younger, cheaper, ascending pass rusher. If Herbig eventually develops into a true star, Pittsburgh may face one of the most difficult defensive decisions in recent franchise history. Paying multiple edge defenders premium-level money while simultaneously trying to build around a future quarterback could force the organization into uncomfortable territory financially. That is why executives around the league are monitoring the situation closely. They understand how rare it would be for a player like T.J. Watt to become available, even hypothetically. A healthy Watt, even in his early 30s, would instantly transform the pass rush of nearly any contender in football. Teams desperate for defensive playmakers would likely line up aggressively if Pittsburgh ever seriously entertained trade discussions. Still, for now, all of this remains speculation surrounding a future scenario that may never actually happen. Watt continues playing at a high level. He remains one of the emotional leaders of the franchise. The Steelers still view him as a foundational piece of the defense, and there is no indication Pittsburgh is actively exploring any type of move in the immediate future. But the fact that league executives are already discussing the possibility tells you how dramatically the NFL changes year by year. Contracts evolve. Rosters shift. Young players emerge. Championship windows open and close quickly. And eventually, even the most iconic players become part of difficult conversations organizations never wanted to have in the first place. Comment if you think there's a real chance T.J. Watt might say goodbye to the Steelers in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.